The police arrived within the hour, summoned by James Whitmore's telephone call from the Manor's study. Inspector Thornton was a man of methodical habits and practical skepticism, qualities that had served him well in a career spanning 30 years. He was 55, with the weathered face of someone who had long ago ceased to be surprised by human behavior, though he remained perpetually disappointed by it. His sergeant, a younger man named Collins with ambitious eyes and an unfortunate tendency toward premature conclusions, immediately began photographing the scene, while the inspector himself stood over the body, with the expression of a man examining an untidy ledger. "Garden shears," Inspector Thornton observed, not removing his hands from his pockets. "Fairly common implements. Where would these have come from?" Lady Ashford, recovering her composure with the steel of someone accustomed to authority, gestured toward the garden shed visible at the property's far corner. "We keep several pairs in the shed for pruning. The gardener comes only twice weekly, and it is Thursday." The inspector nodded slowly, absorbing this information without visible reaction. He turned to address the assembled group, who had been shepherded into the drawing room by a young constable with instructions to remain there until statements could be taken. "I shall need to speak with each of you individually," he announced. "Sergeant Collins will take preliminary statements here. I require a private room for more detailed interviews." The library was selected, and it was there that Miss Marple found herself seated across from Inspector Thornton within 20 minutes, having been called first, as was often the case. The inspector had long ago developed a habit of interviewing elderly ladies early in investigations, a practice born from the mistaken belief that age conferred innocence. It was a useful prejudice, though Miss Marple had never bothered to correct it. "You knew the deceased, I understand," the inspector began, settling into his notes with the patience of a man who had heard countless statements that ultimately led nowhere. "By reputation, primarily," Miss Marple replied, her voice carrying the gentle quality of a woman discussing village gossip over tea, "though I confess I cannot claim to have been among his admirers. Herbert Dalton was a man of considerable influence and very little kindness. He was the sort who believed that financial power granted him license to control others' lives. I have observed similar men before, in my village of St. Mary Mead. They tend to collect enemies the way gardens collect weeds." The inspector glanced up, a slight smile tugging at his mouth despite himself. "Direct assessment. I appreciate it. And where were you at the moment the body was discovered?" "In the drawing room, drinking tea. I had not ventured into the garden since arriving shortly after 2 o'clock. The afternoon was warm, and I prefer to observe people indoors. One learns considerably more about human nature through conversation than through horticultural pursuits." What the inspector did not know, though Miss Marple observed his assumption, was that she had positioned herself with a precise view of the garden through the French door's reflection in a nearby mirror. This habit of seeing without appearing to see had served her well throughout a long life of observing village life, and it served her equally well now. After her interview concluded, Miss Marple returned to the drawing room, where the atmosphere had transformed entirely. The gentle social cohesion of the garden party had shattered, replaced by the electric tension of people suddenly aware that any one of them might be suspected of murder. Margaret Ashford had developed a tremor in her hands. Constance sat with her jaw clenched so tightly that her teeth seemed likely to crack. Young Alice Hartley stared at her teacup as though it contained answers to questions she had not yet formulated. And James Whitmore, the solicitor, had positioned himself near the window with the calculating expression of a man rapidly reassessing several situations. But it was Iris Blackwood who captured Miss Marple's attention most thoroughly. The woman had not moved from her chair since the police arrived, yet her entire being seemed to vibrate with barely contained emotion. She had removed her grey coat, presumably under the stress of the afternoon heat, and Miss Marple could see with perfect clarity what the coat had previously concealed. Upon Iris Blackwood's right sleeve there was a long, deliberately placed patch of darker wool, sewn with obvious care and precision. It covered something beneath, some detail the woman wished hidden from casual observation. It was a patch one might place over a tear, Miss Marple reflected, or over a stain that would not wash away. As the afternoon light began its inevitable decline toward evening, and as Inspector Thornton continued his methodical interviews in the library, Miss Marple settled back into her wicker chair. The tea had long grown cold, untouched. She did not require refreshment. What she required was time to observe and consider, to note the small inconsistencies in people's statements, the moments when eyes flickered or hands trembled. Herbert Dalton lay dead in Lady Ashford's rose garden, dispatched with a rather specific choice of instrument, and the killer walked freely among them all, waiting to discover whether their secret would hold or shatter beneath the weight of scrutiny. Miss Marple knew from long experience that it was only a matter of time before the truth began emerging, fragment by fragment, like pieces of a puzzle gradually falling into place. By the time dusk settled over Thornfield, Inspector Thornton had conducted preliminary interviews with every person present at the garden party, and the initial contours of the investigation had begun to emerge with the clarity of a photograph developing in chemical solution. Herbert Dalton, it transpired, had visited the manor that afternoon uninvited, arriving shortly after 2 o'clock with what Lady Ashford described as pressing business that she had been too preoccupied with her guests to address directly. She had instructed Edward to attend to him, and Edward, displaying characteristic vagueness, had suggested that Dalton might await her in the library, while he himself retreated to the terrace. No one, it seemed, had actually seen Dalton alive after approximately 2:15. The body had been discovered at 3 o'clock, though the precise time of death remained uncertain. The garden shears, when examined by the inspector, bore no clear fingerprints, having been wiped clean with deliberate care. They matched a set stored in Lady Ashford's garden shed, where several pairs remained untouched and 3 were notably absent, one presumably the murder weapon and 2 others unaccounted for. Inspector Thornton's working theory, expressed to Sergeant Collins with the confidence of a man accustomed to straightforward conclusions, centered upon Edward Ashford. Edward had motive. Dalton's loans to him had mounted considerably, and repayment deadlines loomed with uncomfortable proximity. Edward had opportunity. He had been alone on the terrace at the critical time. And Edward, Thornton noted with satisfaction, had demonstrable anxiety regarding his financial circumstances that made him a plausible suspect for desperate action. "We shall arrest him in the morning," the inspector announced, pending fuller investigation. Tonight, I want constables posted at the manor, and I want no one leaving Thornfield without explicit permission." It was at this precise moment that Miss Marple, who had been sitting quietly in the corner of Lady Ashford's drawing-room with her knitting, set down her needles and spoke with the gentle firmness that had, over the years, proven remarkably difficult for people to ignore. "Inspector," she said, "I wonder if I might impose upon your time for a private word. There is a matter that I believe may prove relevant to your investigation." The inspector, who had been in the process of instructing Sergeant Collins regarding morning arrangements, paused with the slight irritation of a man being delayed from his predetermined conclusions. Nonetheless, professional courtesy demanded that he hear out an elderly woman, particularly one who had demonstrated the sharp observational skills evident in her earlier statement. The library, where they had spoken before, seemed smaller and more shadowed in the evening lamplight. Miss Marple moved to a chair by the window and settled herself with careful deliberation before speaking. "Herbert Dalton," she began, "was not a man given to unannounced visits without significant purpose. My observation of village life, Inspector, has taught me that people's behavior follows patterns as consistent as nature itself. When those patterns shift, it generally indicates something of consequence. Mr. Dalton's presence here today, uninvited and pressing, suggests that he had discovered something requiring immediate confrontation. The question becomes, with whom?" "Your point, madam." The inspector's tone was polite but impatient. "My point, Inspector, is that young Mr. Ashford may indeed have motive and opportunity, but motive and opportunity are remarkably common elements in any death. What is less common is the proper construction of circuit. I observed, through the garden's reflection in the drawing-room mirror, that Mr. Edward Ashford was not alone on the terrace at 2:20. Someone joined him briefly, and their conversation appeared quite heated, though I could not hear words through the glass. The inspector leaned forward slightly. "Who was this person?" "That I could not determine from the reflection," Miss Marple admitted. "But I can tell you that Mrs. Margaret Ashford's shoes. She wears a distinctive pair of Italian heels with a particular clicking sound upon the terrace stones, were not the feet that crossed to meet him. Nor, based on the silhouette and gait, were they Mrs. Constance Ashford's. This leaves a considerably smaller pool of individuals." Inspector Thornton was now attending with genuine interest. "You believe Edward did not commit this crime?" "I believe," Miss Marple said carefully, "that assuming guilt based on financial motive is the approach of someone who has not truly observed human nature in its complexity. I have known many people with desperate financial circumstances, Inspector. Financial desperation alone does not typically drive people to murder with garden shears, which requires considerable physical force and intimate knowledge of the victim's routine. It requires, in fact, opportunity that extends beyond a single afternoon at a social gathering. Then who?" The inspector's frustration was beginning to show. Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair, moving toward the window that overlooked the now darkened garden. "That, Inspector, requires considerably more investigation than has thus far been conducted. But I would suggest that you examine more carefully the relationships between the deceased and his creditors. Financial entanglement, in my experience, often involves more than one person, and I would particularly recommend questioning Miss Blackwood regarding previous residence and any connection she might have had to Mr. Dalton prior to her arrival in Thornfield 6 months ago." The inspector's expression shifted, questions forming behind his eyes. "How could you possibly—" She recognized him, Miss Marple interrupted gently. "When his body was discovered, she recognized him. Not with shock, but with a peculiar kind of inevitability. And the patch upon her sleeve, Inspector, covers something she wished very much to conceal. That much, at least, is observable to anyone willing to truly look. The morning broke grey and uncertain over Thornfield, with clouds gathering in formations that suggested rain by afternoon. Inspector Thornton had spent most of the night conducting the additional investigations that Miss Marple's observations had prompted, and his manner when he appeared at the manor shortly after breakfast carried the chastened quality of a man whose assumptions had been thoroughly disrupted by evidence. Sergeant Collins followed in his wake, bearing a leather portfolio and an expression of confusion regarding the sudden shift in investigative direction. "Miss Blackwood has admitted to a prior acquaintance with the deceased," Inspector Thornton announced without preamble, settling into the library chair where he had sat the previous evening. "She lived in London until 6 months ago, where she worked as a nurse in a private establishment. Dalton was a frequent visitor to that establishment, where he apparently engaged in various financial arrangements of questionable legality. Miss Blackwood declined to elaborate further without legal representation, which she has, somewhat predictably, requested." Miss Marple continued her needlework with undisturbed concentration, though her attention was entirely focused upon the inspector's words. "And the patch upon her sleeve conceals a scar," Thornton replied grimly. "Quite a substantial one, running from her wrist nearly to her elbow. She claims it is old, from a childhood accident. However, the medical examination suggests considerably more recent origin, within the past 2 years, certainly. The tissue is still somewhat discolored beneath the scar tissue. A burn, perhaps?" Miss Marple ventured, her needles clicking softly. "Or a laceration from something quite sharp." The doctor was uncertain, but here is what is curious, and what prompted me to pursue your suggestion regarding Miss Blackwood further. James Whitmore, the solicitor, has admitted that Dalton came to him 3 weeks ago, requesting information regarding inheritance laws and the disposition of property when death occurs under suspicious circumstances. Whitmore refused to elaborate on the specific details Dalton sought, citing client confidentiality, but he did acknowledge that the conversation concerned him sufficiently to warrant consideration of contacting local authorities. Sergeant Collins, who had been standing near the window with the restless energy of youth, interjected with poorly concealed frustration. "Sir, this still does not establish that Miss Blackwood killed him. She could have been blackmailing him, but that does not necessarily—" "No, "It does not," Miss Marple agreed quietly, setting down her knitting. "But it does establish that there was considerably more complexity to Mr. Dalton's circumstances than initially apparent. Inspector, I wonder if you have examined the matter of why Mr. Dalton visited Thornfield Manor specifically at this particular time." Thornton leaned back, considering. "Lady Ashford claims he came regarding some matter related to her son's debts. However, when pressed, she could not specify what exactly he intended to discuss. Edward himself was evasive regarding the conversation. And yet," Miss Marple continued, "someone did me. It with Mr. Ashford upon the terrace at approximately 2:20. Someone whose footfall and silhouette suggest neither Mr. Edward nor Mrs. Constance nor Mrs. Margaret Ashford. Have you considered, Inspector, that this person might have been Miss Blackwood herself?" The inspector's eyes sharpened. "You believe she engineered the meeting? That she lured Dalton to the garden knowing the family dynamics would prevent anyone from noticing her presence?" "I believe," Miss Marple said with careful precision, "that Miss Blackwood has been far more strategically positioned in this village than anyone initially recognized. She has been here 6 months, which is precisely long enough to establish residency and local familiarity, but not so long that her background has been thoroughly investigated by the casual gossip networks of village society. She took the cottage at Sparrow Nest deliberately. I checked the property records last evening through. The cottage at Sparrow Nest was a modest structure of weathered stone and climbing ivy, situated at the village's eastern edge, where the carefully maintained gardens of civilization began their gradual surrender to wild countryside. Inspector Thornton's team moved through it with the systematic thoroughness of men accustomed to extracting secrets from spaces that had harbored them. Miss Marple had remained at Thornfield Manor, as was proper, but she received word of the search's findings through the efficient gossip network that constituted the village's true nervous system. What they discovered was both revelatory and damning. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the cottage's small bedroom was a collection of documents and photographs spanning nearly 15 years. Letters, written in a hand that matched handwriting samples from medical records at the London establishment where Iris Blackwood had worked. Photographs of a younger woman, recognizably Iris Blackwood, though with unguarded eyes that suggested contentment, alongside a man whose face appeared in multiple images, Herbert Dalton, years younger, but unmistakably the same individual now lying in Thornfield's morgue. And among these photographs were hospital discharge documents, dated 12 years prior, bearing the name Margaret Iris Blackwood, and citing severe complications from a miscarriage, along with injuries sustained during the same incident. It was James Whitmore, summoned by Inspector Thornton to provide legal perspective on the documents, who made the critical connection. He arrived at the cottage with the gravity of a man bearing news of considerable consequence, and it was to Miss Marple that he first reported his findings, seeking her counsel before presenting them to the inspector. "The woman's legal name is Margaret Iris Blackwood," Whitmore explained, settling into the manor's library chair with the weight of revelation pressing upon his shoulders. "Not Iris Blackwood as she has represented herself, and according to records I have accessed through certain channels in London, she was married to Herbert Dalton. The marriage took place 20 years ago, when she was Margaret Ashworth. They divorced acrimoniously 12 years ago, following what the court documents describe as irreparable breakdown due to cruelty and financial misconduct." Miss Marple's needles paused in their rhythmic motion. "Cruelty and financial misconduct," she repeated softly. "Not the language typically employed in divorce proceedings, unless circumstances were quite severe." "Precisely so," Whitmore agreed grimly. "The sealed documents, which I was able to examine through correspondence with the original solicitor, detail allegations of domestic violence and systematic financial exploitation. Dalton apparently controlled all her assets, used her earnings from nursing to finance various speculative ventures, and when she attempted to leave him, he threatened to ensure she would never work in medical practice again. The miscarriage occurred during an altercation, and the injuries were consistent with deliberate violence. The room seemed to grow colder despite the warming afternoon beyond the windows. Miss Marple set down her knitting with deliberate care, her pale blue eyes reflecting understanding, that had perhaps arrived earlier than she had allowed herself to fully acknowledge. And yet, she said thoughtfully, the divorce was finalized successfully. He did not succeed in destroying her career entirely. No, Whitmore confirmed. She disappeared from London after the divorce, taking a position in a private nursing establishment under her middle name. But here is what is significant. Dalton has been systematically locating her every few years. 3 times in the past decade, she has been forced to relocate because he discovered her whereabouts and renewed harassment. Letters, threats regarding the circumstances of their divorce, demands for money he claimed she owed him. The final relocation, 6 months ago, brought her to Thornfield, ostensibly to begin a new life, but I suspect with considerably darker intentions. Inspector Thornton arrived at the manor within the hour, bearing additional evidence that elevated speculation into something approaching certainty. Dalton's London residence had been searched, and correspondence was discovered indicating that he had located Iris Blackwood once again approximately 3 months prior. His letters to her were a mixture of predatory nostalgia and barely concealed threats, suggesting that his obsession with her had not diminished in the slightest during their years of separation. She knew he would find her eventually, the inspector mused aloud, pacing the library with the rest. Less energy of a man whose investigation had taken on tragic dimensions beyond simple criminal violence. She chose to orchestrate the confrontation rather than be hunted again. Miss Marple rose from her chair and moved toward the window overlooking the garden where Herbert Dalton had been found. The roses had been cordoned off with police tape, their beauty rendered somehow obscene by proximity to violence. She stood silently for a long moment before speaking. The question that remains, Inspector, is not whether Miss Blackwood killed him. The evidence suggests quite clearly that she did. The question is whether anyone in this village, knowing what we now know of his treatment of her, can honestly say that justice has been served by his death, or whether it has merely been that his long pattern of cruelty has finally encountered a victim sufficiently desperate to respond with equivalent force. Inspector Thornton did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man confronting uncomfortable complexities in a world he had previously viewed in starker terms. "We must find her," he said finally. "The law requires it, regardless of the circumstances that led to her actions." And at that precise moment, as if responding to some invisible signal, a constable entered breathlessly with news that would shift the investigation's trajectory once more. Miss Blackwood had been located, not fleeing toward the village boundaries, but standing alone in the parish church, waiting calmly in the front pew as though she had been expecting them all along. The parish church of St. Michael's stood at Thornfield's heart like a stone sentinel bearing witness to centuries of human folly and redemption. Its interior was cool and shadowed, illuminated primarily by afternoon light filtering through Victorian stained glass that transformed ordinary daylight into something sacred and strange. Iris Blackwood sat in the front pew with the stillness of a woman who had finally reached the terminus of a journey that had consumed her entire being. Her grey coat lay folded beside her, and in her lap rested her hands, folded with almost meditative calm. Inspector Thornton entered with Sergeant Collins and 2 constables, their footsteps echoing against stone in a rhythm that seemed to underscore the gravity of the moment. Miss Marple, despite her years and the modesty that characterized her manner, had insisted upon accompanying them. She took a seat in the pew behind Iris Blackwood, settling herself with the quiet dignity of someone attending a particularly solemn service. "Miss Blackwood," Inspector Thornton began, his voice carrying the official formality required by the circumstances, "I must inform you that we have discovered documentation regarding your previous relationship with the deceased, as well as evidence suggesting your involvement in his death. You are entitled to legal representation, and anything you say may be used." "I killed him," Iris Blackwood interrupted quietly, her voice carrying no inflection of defiance or remorse, merely statement of fact. "I killed Herbert Dalton deliberately, and with full knowledge of the consequences. I have been waiting to say those words for longer than you can possibly comprehend, Inspector. The relief of finally speaking them is almost worth whatever penalty must follow." She turned slowly to face them, and her eyes, when they met the inspector's, held the peculiar clarity of someone who has finally set down an unbearable burden. I did not flee because I needed time to escape. I came here to ensure that you would find everything, the documents, the letters, the proof of what he had done to me. I wanted you to understand not merely that I killed him, but why. And I wanted to do it. In a place of sanctuary, where I could finally tell the truth without fear. Inspector Thornton exchanged a glance with Sergeant Collins, uncertainty crossing both their faces. This was not the expected trajectory of a manhunt's conclusion. Criminals typically attempted to escape or deny involvement. They did not confess with such calculated clarity and then position themselves to ensure comprehensive investigation of their own guilt. It was Miss Marple who spoke next, her voice carrying the weight of long observation and deeper understanding. "Tell us what happened on Thursday afternoon, Miss Blackwood. Tell us everything." Iris Blackwood was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed upon the altar where candles burned in small glass holders, flames dancing with hypnotic repetition. When she finally spoke, her narrative emerged with the careful precision of testimony that had been rehearsed countless times in private anguish. I did not know he was at Thornfield Manor until Edward Ashford mentioned it to Alice Hartley in the village post office, where I happened to be purchasing stamps. I heard them discussing his arrival, heard Edward's anxiety regarding debts, and I understood immediately what had occurred. Herbert had found me again. He had come to extract payment in whatever form his vindictive mind could conceive. It is a pattern that has governed the past 12 years of my existence. Discovery, extraction, relocation, temporary peace, then discovery once more. She paused, her hands tightening slightly. I did not plan to kill him that afternoon. I planned merely to speak with him, to explain that I had moved beyond his reach, that the past no longer held dominion over me. But when I found him in the garden, he had wandered out onto the terrace seeking some form of leverage over Edward. I understood that words would never be sufficient. He saw me and smiled that rebel smile, the one that always preceded cruelty. He said he had always known I would prove useful again, that he had merely been waiting for the proper moment to re-establish their connection. "How did you manage to access the garden shears without being observed?" Inspector Thornton asked, his tone professional but his expression troubled. "I took them from the shed the previous day, during my walk past the manor. I replaced them with branches of similar length and weight, wrapped in burlap. The deception would have lasted perhaps a day before discovery, but by then the pattern of investigation would have been established. I returned to the shed after the killing and replaced the shears with the extras I had taken, creating confusion regarding which pair had been the weapon. It was a simple matter of misdirection." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "And the patch upon your sleeve, the scar it conceals?" Iris Blackwood rolled up her sleeve with deliberate slowness, revealing the full extent of the scarring beneath. It formed a pattern consistent with deliberate burning, the kind of injury that spoke of prolonged suffering rather than accident. He did this when I attempted to leave him the first time, before our marriage had deteriorated sufficiently for the courts to grant divorce. He held my arm against the kitchen stove and told me that I belonged to him, that I could never escape him. The scar has been a reminder every moment of the past 12 years that some damage cannot be undone, only endured. The church seemed to hold its breath. Even the candles before the altar appeared to burn more quietly, as though the stones themselves were listening to this accounting of pain and its consequences. "He deserved to die," Iris Blackwood continued, her voice steady. "But more than that, I deserve to live without fear. So I have taken the choice that circumstances are acquired. I will face whatever judgment society deems appropriate. But I will face it as a woman who has finally reclaimed agency over her own existence. That is not nothing, Inspector. In fact, I suspect it is everything." Inspector Thornton stood in silence, the weight of her confession settling upon him with uncomfortable significance. The law was clear regarding murder, but the circumstances that had produced it were not. And in that moment, standing in a stone church where mercy and justice were theoretically indistinguishable, everyone present understood that they were witnessing something far more complex than simple criminality. The trial of Iris Blackwood took place 3 months later in the autumn assizes, when the leaves had turned to copper and gold, and the world seemed to have acquired a quality of melancholic reflection appropriate to questions of culpability and consequence. Miss Marple attended every session, seated in the gallery with her knitting, her needles clicking with their familiar rhythm as barristers constructed and deconstructed the architecture of guilt and circumstance. The courtroom gallery was perpetually crowded. The case had acquired considerable notoriety, particularly in London newspapers, where Iris Blackwood's story had been transformed into the kind of narrative that revealed uncomfortable truths about institutions designed to protect the powerful rather than the vulnerable. The prosecution's case was straightforward and methodically presented. Iris Blackwood had deliberately murdered Herbert Dalton using a method that required premeditation and access to the crime scene. The garden shears had been taken from Thornfield Manor's shed and used as the weapon. The body had been positioned with calculated care. Witness testimony established her presence at the garden party and her connection to the deceased through their previous marriage. The motive was clear: revenge for years of abuse and harassment. By the law's unforgiving standard, these facts constituted murder, and the penalty for murder was execution. The defense, conducted by a barrister of considerable skill and progressive inclination named Mr. Pemberton, took a different approach. Rather than denying the killing, he sought to establish that circumstances had created a form of necessity that justified her actions. He presented medical evidence regarding the severity of her injuries, expert testimony concerning the psychological impact of prolonged abuse, and correspondence from Dalton himself that demonstrated his obsessive pursuit and explicit threats. He called character witnesses who testified to her competence as a nurse, her stability in employment, and her genuine integration into village life. He established, with careful precision, that she had not been a desperate criminal, but rather a woman systematically hunted by a man whose legal rights had been exhausted, but whose capacity for harm remained undiminished. But it was Miss Marple's testimony, delivered on the trial's 3rd day, that seemed to alter something fundamental in the courtroom's atmosphere. She had been summoned by the defense, and she took the witness stand with the unflappable calm that had characterized her entire involvement in the investigation. "Miss Marple," Mr. Pemberton began, his tone respectful but purposeful, "you have had considerable experience observing human nature and village life. In your assessment, what was Iris Blackwood's state of mind during her residence in Thornfield?" Miss Marple considered the question with her characteristic thoughtfulness before responding. She was a woman living in perpetual anticipation of discovery. "I observed her on multiple occasions checking the window of her cottage, monitoring strangers who arrived in the village, maintaining constant vigilance regarding her own safety. This is not the behavior of someone at peace, Mr. Pemberton. This is the behavior of someone whose nerves have been worn to transparency by years of fear and her relationship with the other villagers." "Friendly but distant," Miss Marple replied. "She participated in village activities but did not fully commit herself to community integration. I believe, observing her pattern of behavior, that she had learned through previous relocations that true friendship would make departure more painful. She was protecting herself emotionally while simultaneously attempting to establish a life that might finally prove permanent." The prosecution's cross-examination was pointed. "Is it not true, Miss Marple, that despite her obvious trauma, she maintained employment, paid her rent, and conducted herself lawfully in all respects until the moment she committed murder?" "That is entirely true," Miss Marple acknowledged, "which perhaps indicates that capability for law-abiding behavior does not necessarily indicate immunity to desperation when subjected to sufficient provocation." The trial continued for another week, with expert medical witnesses and psychological assessments, adding layers of complexity to the question of whether Iris Blackwood's actions constituted murder or something more nuanced, an act of self-defense extended across years of systematic abuse. The jury was instructed by the judge in language that was technically precise but emotionally unforgiving. The law recognized no justification for killing another human being, regardless of prior mistreatment. Murder was murder, and its penalty was prescribed by statute. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning with a verdict that stunned the courtroom. Despite the prosecution's apparently conclusive case, guilty of manslaughter, not murder. The distinction was significant. Manslaughter carried a sentence of imprisonment rather than execution, and the judge, a man of considerable age and apparent exhaustion regarding the matter, imposed a sentence of 15 years with the possibility of review after 10, conditional upon demonstration of genuine rehabilitation. As Iris Blackwood was led from the courtroom, her expression did not change. She had been neither acquitted nor escaped consequence, but rather had been granted something almost unprecedented in cases of domestic violence, a legal system's acknowledgement that some circumstances exist beyond the simple binary of guilt and innocence. She had survived Herbert Dalton's death, and, more importantly, she would survive the law's judgment as well. Miss Marple left the courtroom with the autumn rain beginning to fall, washing the streets of London with the cleansing certainty of seasonal change. Inspector Thornton walked beside her toward the street, where a car awaited to return her to St. Mary Mead and the quiet village life she had briefly interrupted to bear witness to Thornfield's darker mysteries. "You knew from the beginning that she was guilty," the inspector observed. "Yet you guided the investigation in a manner that established her prior victimization." "I knew that she had killed him," Miss Marple corrected gently. "But knowing someone's guilt and understanding the circumstances that produced that guilt are not identical matters, Inspector. Justice, in my experience, requires the latter rather more urgently than the former." The rain continued to fall as they reached the vehicle, and Miss Marple settled into its warmth with the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed, the world's complexities acknowledged, if not fully resolved. The journey back to St. Mary Mead took the better part of a day, with Miss Marple spending the hours in quiet reflection as the English landscape unrolled beyond the car windows in gradations of autumn color. Inspector Thornton's words had lingered in her mind with the persistence of a melody one cannot quite dismiss, though she had long ago ceased to be troubled by the gap between legal guilt and moral complexity. The law, she had observed over decades of village observation, was a blunt instrument designed for clarity, but capable only of crude approximation when applied to the subtle gradations of human motivation and circumstance. What troubled her more was something she had not shared with the inspector, something she had observed during Iris Blackwood's confession in the church, and had confirmed through subsequent investigation. There had been, during those critical moments in the garden when Herbert Dalton met his death, a moment of hesitation visible in Iris Blackwood's testimony, a moment when she spoke of Edward Ashford meeting someone on the terrace, of heated conversation, of anxiety that seemed to exceed the bounds of mere debt concern. The story had been told with considerable care, but Miss Marple had spent sufficient years observing human behavior to recognize when a narrative had been constructed with deliberate intent to obscure rather than illuminate. Upon returning to St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple found waiting in her cottage a letter bearing the Thornfield postmark. It had been written by James Whitmore, the solicitor, and its contents suggested that her instincts regarding incompleteness in the case had been sound. Whitmore requested an urgent meeting, citing matters of professional delicacy that required discussion away from official channels. Miss Marple, recognizing in this phrasing the particular anxiety of a lawyer confronting an ethical quandary, invited him to tea the following afternoon. Whitmore arrived punctually, a man visibly aged by the events of the preceding months, his usually composed demeanor replaced by something approaching distress. He accepted tea with mechanical courtesy and waited until Miss Marple had settled herself before speaking. "I have violated professional confidence," he began without preamble, "but I can do so no longer without becoming complicit in a greater injustice than the one already perpetrated. During the trial I was approached by Margaret Ashford, Edward's mother, with information that I should have disclosed to the prosecution but which professional privilege technically allowed me to withhold. I chose to remain silent, believing that Iris Blackwood's conviction and imprisonment constituted sufficient justice for Herbert Dalton's death. I am now aware that my silence was cowardice disguised as professional ethics." Miss Marple set down her teacup with careful deliberation. "Tell me, Mr. Whitmore, tell me what Margaret Ashford revealed to you." "Edward Ashford did not kill Herbert Dalton," Whitmore said quietly, "but he came very close to doing so, and only the intervention of his mother prevented it. When Dalton arrived at Thornfield Manor that afternoon, he had come to collect on debts that extended beyond mere financial obligation. He had evidence, false evidence, but evidence nonetheless, suggesting that Edward had misappropriated funds from his bank position. Dalton threatened to present this evidence unless Edward agreed to transfer a substantial sum from his mother's estate into accounts controlled by Dalton. It was extortion, and Edward, in his panic and fury, briefly considered violent response. "The conversation on the terrace," Miss Marple said softly. "The one I observed through the garden's reflection." "Precisely. Margaret Ashford witnessed her son's distress, and she followed him to the terrace to discover what had occurred. She listened to Edward's account of Dalton's threats and demands, and in that moment she made a decision that she has clearly come to regret. She told Edward to allow her to handle the matter, and she herself went to confront Dalton in the garden. The autumn light streaming through Miss Marple's windows seemed to acquire a quality of terrible clarity. She understood, in the way that years of observing village life had taught her to understand, what James Whitmore was struggling to articulate. "Margaret Ashford killed Herbert Dalton," Miss Marple said with absolute certainty, "not Iris Blackwood. Margaret Ashford took the garden shears and confronted him in the roses, and when he refused to relinquish his threats against her son, she drove them into his back with the efficiency of someone whose desperation exceeded her moral scruples." Whitmore's expression confirmed this assessment. "She claims it was not murder but rather an act committed in defense of her son, in protection of the family. But when Iris Blackwood was taken into custody and began to confess, Margaret made a decision that has haunted me since its occurrence. She allowed an innocent woman to be convicted of her crime. She told me afterward that she believed Iris Blackwood to be guilty anyway, that justice would be served even if not in the precise manner that facts dictated. She believed that Dalton's death was ultimately Iris Blackwood's responsibility, that without Iris's presence in the village, he would never have come to Thornfield at all." Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair and moved toward the window overlooking her garden, where roses grew in careful profusion, each blossom beautiful in its individual particularity, yet part of a larger pattern that only became apparent when viewed from sufficient distance. "And yet," she said quietly, "Iris Blackwood has now been imprisoned for a crime she did not commit, while Margaret Ashford moves freely through society, her conscience apparently accommodated by a rationalization that shifts responsibility from herself to another. This is not justice, Mr. Whitmore. This is the substitution of one crime with another, more insidious form of injustice. I have been wrestling with the question of disclosure," Whitmore admitted. "But to reveal what I know would be to destroy Edward's life and reputation along with his mother's. And it would require me to violate confidences that were shared with me in expectation of professional protection." Miss Marple turned from the window, and her pale blue eyes held the quality of someone who had spent a lifetime confronting the uncomfortable reality that human morality does not conform neatly to the structures designed to contain it. Professional ethics, Mr. Whitmore, exist to serve justice, not to obstruct it. When they are employed to shield guilt rather than protect innocence, they cease to be ethics and become merely another form of corruption. The question hung between them, unresolved and laden with consequence, as the autumn afternoon gradually surrendered to evening. The matter remained unresolved for precisely 6 days, during which time Miss Marple conducted herself with her customary quiet routine, though those who knew her well might have observed a certain intensity in her correspondence and an unusual number of telephone calls made from the village post office. James Whitmore, meanwhile, had returned to Thornfield in a state of visible distress, his professional composure fractured by the collision between ethical obligation and personal loyalty, between the law's demands and the consequences that disclosure would inevitably produce. On the 7th day, Miss Marple received a visitor. Margaret Ashford arrived in a motor car driven by a professional chauffeur, her appearance unchanged from that afternoon at the garden party where Herbert Dalton had been discovered among the roses. yet somehow fundamentally altered by the weight of knowledge that now existed between them. She requested a private interview, and Miss Marple, with the courtesy that had characterized her entire investigation, invited her into the sitting room where tea had been prepared with anticipatory precision. "You know," Margaret Ashford said without preamble, settling into the chair opposite Miss Marple's with the stiffness of someone whose composure is maintained only through considerable muscular effort. "Mr. Whitmore informed me of his intention to speak with you. I have come to ask you not to press him further regarding disclosure of information that would destroy my family." Miss Marple poured tea with unhurried care, allowing the silence to extend until Margaret Ashford's anxiety became almost visible, a tremor in her hands as she accepted the offered cup. "I wonder," Miss Marple began gently, "whether you have considered what it means to allow another person to bear the burden of your actions. Iris Blackwood is now imprisoned, her life circumscribed by walls and restrictions, her reputation irretrievably damaged. And all of this occurred because you chose to accept responsibility for a crime that was, in fact, your own deliberate act." "She confessed," Margaret Ashford said defensively, though her voice lacked conviction. "She claimed responsibility. If she chose to accept punishment for my actions, that was her own decision. Was it?" Miss Marple set down her own teacup and folded her hands with the deliberate care of someone preparing to articulate a truth that requires no ornamentation. "Iris Blackwood confessed because she believed, reasonably, that you would allow the investigation to proceed as planned. She did not know that you were the actual perpetrator. She sacrificed herself believing that her sacrifice would at least clarify the circumstances of Dalton's death, and perhaps, through that clarification, prevent her own continued victimization by a legal system, indifferent to the reasons behind her desperate actions." Margaret Ashford's composure fractured visibly. Tears emerged, not of remorse but of something more desperate. The tears of a woman confronting the magnitude of her own moral failure. "I killed him to protect my son," she whispered. "Edward was being destroyed by Dalton's threats. I could not allow that to happen. I simply could not." "Of course you could not," Miss Marple replied, her tone carrying genuine sympathy alongside absolute moral clarity. "Just as Iris Blackwood could not allow herself to be hunted indefinitely by a man who had already destroyed so much of her life. The question is not whether your motivation was comprehensible, Mrs. Ashford. The question is whether comprehensible motivation justifies allowing an innocent person to suffer punishment for your actions." The conversation continued for another hour, a dialogue conducted in the quiet afternoon light of Miss Marple's sitting room, between a woman who had committed murder in protection of her son and an elderly lady whose entire life had been devoted to understanding the patterns of human behavior and moral consequence. By the time Margaret Ashford rose to leave, her face had aged perceptibly, as though the burden she had been carrying in secret had suddenly become too substantial to conceal. "What will you do?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "I will do what I have always done," Miss Marple replied. "I will present the facts as I understand them to those who bear responsibility for determining their disposition. But I will do so in a manner that gives you the opportunity to present your own account before others force the matter into public scrutiny. That much, I believe, is fair, though fairness is a concept that has become somewhat complicated in this affair." 2 days later, Inspector Thornton received a telephone call from James Whitmore informing him that Margaret Ashford had requested an official meeting at Thornfield Manor regarding new evidence in the case of Herbert Dalton's death. When the inspector arrived, accompanied by Sergeant Collins and bearing with him the mixture of official authority and professional weariness that had become his constant companions, he found not only Margaret Ashford awaiting him, but also Edward Ashford, looking considerably younger and more vulnerable than his usual. Demeanor suggested was possible. Margaret Ashford's confession, delivered with the composed clarity of a woman who has finally relinquished the burden of deception, took slightly less than an hour to articulate. She detailed her confrontation with Dalton in the garden, his refusal to be moved by her pleas regarding Edward's innocence, his escalating threats, and his obvious satisfaction in wielding power over the family. She described, without sentiment or excuse, the moment when she had retrieved the garden shears and driven them into his body, not in a moment of passion, but with the deliberate intention of ending the threat he represented. "I did not plan to kill him," she said, her hands folded in her lap with perfect stillness. "But when the moment came, and I understood that he would never release his hold over my son, I made the choice that seemed to me necessary. I have come to understand, through discussion with Miss Marple, that allowing Iris Blackwood to be imprisoned for my actions was not a necessary consequence of my crime, but rather an additional crime that I committed through silence and deception. I cannot undo that injustice, but I can end my complicity in it." Inspector Thornton listened without interruption, his expression unreadable, his mind clearly engaged in the complex calculation of legal procedure and human consequence that the confession demanded. "You understand," he said finally, "that this confession will require the formal review of Miss Blackwood's conviction, and almost certainly her release. It will also require your arrest and prosecution for Herbert Dalton's murder." "I understand," Margaret Ashford replied, "and I accept these consequences as payment for actions that were both deliberate and, in their fullest implications, far more destructive than I allowed myself to acknowledge at the time. The legal machinery that had been set in. Motion to prosecute Iris Blackwood was reversed with considerably more difficulty than one might expect from an institution ostensibly devoted to accuracy and justice. Appeals were filed, court orders issued, and review proceedings initiated in an atmosphere of considerable legal and social discomfort. The case had become, through its unexpected reversal, a matter of considerable public attention, with newspapers conducting themselves with their customary mixture of sensationalism and moral outrage regarding the apparent failure of the criminal justice system to arrive at truth through its first attempt. Iris Blackwood was released from imprisonment on a Wednesday morning in early December, nearly 5 months after her conviction. She emerged from the prison gates into a world that had changed considerably in her absence, or at least had revealed itself to have changed, though Miss Marple understood that the world itself remained fundamentally consistent in its paradoxes and complexities. It was her capacity to recognize this paradox, that justice and injustice, guilt and innocence, had proven far more complicated than anyone involved in the initial investigation had acknowledged, that had guided her entire approach to the affair. Inspector Thornton brought word of Iris Blackwood's release to Miss Marple in person, driving to St. Mary Mead specifically to inform her that the young woman had requested an audience with the elderly detective before determining her next course of action. There was something almost apologetic in the inspector's manner, as though he bore personal responsibility for the system's failure to perceive truth through its first examination of evidence. "She has been offered considerable financial settlement from the Crown," the inspector reported, settling into Miss Marple's sitting room with the gratitude of a man grateful for a place of quiet revel. "Action, in recognition of the injustice done to her during imprisonment. She has declined it, stating that no sum of money could compensate for the time lost, and that accepting it would somehow imply that the error could be rectified through monetary means." "Wise," Miss Marple observed. "Some harms cannot be remedied through standard compensation. The question is not whether money might repair the damage, but whether the attempt to repair damage through money demonstrates an understanding of the harm's true nature." Iris Blackwood arrived at Miss Marple's cottage the following afternoon, and the elderly detective was struck immediately by the observable changes that imprisonment had produced. The woman was thinner, her hair grayer, her eyes holding a quality of hardened resignation that had not been present even during her confession in the church. Yet there was also something else, a particular clarity, as though the removal of false conviction had paradoxically refined rather than damaged her understanding of herself. "I have come to thank you," Iris Blackwood began, seating herself with careful composure in the chair that had become almost habitual for significant visitors. "Not for freeing me from imprisonment, that was accomplished through legal procedure, but for insisting upon truth when the easier course would have been to accept convenient fiction. Margaret Ashford's confession cost her considerably. My understanding is that she faces significant prison time herself. She faces 15 years, Miss Marple confirmed, which exceeds only slightly the sentence you received, though for a crime that was, in technical terms, more defensible than her own. She killed in protection of her son, you killed in protection of yourself. The law does not necessarily distinguish between these motivations with sufficient subtlety. And yet, Iris Blackwood said thoughtfully, Margaret Ashford's action was premeditated and deliberate in ways that mine was not. She retrieved the shears. She positioned herself for confrontation. She made conscious choice at each moment. My own killing was impulsive, a response to provocation rather than calculated response to systematic threat. Miss Marple considered this assessment with the attention she typically granted to genuine moral inquiry. You are more generous in your judgment of her actions than circumstances warrant, I suspect, but I believe I understand your reasoning. You recognize in her a woman acting from desperation, just as you were acting from desperation. You understand that the circumstances which produced her crime are more comprehensible, if not more forgivable, than the legal system's initial assessment suggested. I understand, Iris Blackwood said quietly, that Herbert Dalton was a man who destroyed people for pleasure and profit. I understand that he had destroyed me, and that he would have continued destroying those around him indefinitely if someone had not intervened. I also understand that I was prepared to accept responsibility for his death, even knowing that I had not committed it, because in some profound sense, his death was a consequence of the choices he had made and the harm he had inflicted. Whether I personally wielded the shears seems, from that perspective, almost irrelevant. A dangerous philosophy, Miss Marple observed, if universally applied. It would suggest that anyone bearing responsibility for circumstances that produce harm bears responsibility for the violence those circumstances generate. But it is a philosophy with considerable merit when applied to specific situations rather than general principles. The conversation continued through the afternoon, moving gradually from discussion of the case itself toward questions of what Iris Blackwood intended for her future. She had decided to leave Thornfield, she explained, and to leave England entirely. She had secured employment as a nurse in a private hospital in Switzerland, a position that offered both professional opportunity and geographic distance from the village that had been simultaneously her sanctuary and her doom. She would begin this new chapter in January, and before departure, she had come to St. Mary Mead specifically to understand how Miss Marple had perceived the truth that others had initially missed. It was not deduction, Miss Marple explained gently, but rather observation of patterns that village life had taught me to recognize. You recognized Herbert Dalton with a kind of inevitability that suggested prior knowledge rather than mere coincidence. The patch upon your sleeve concealed something significant. People do not hide old scars unless those scars carry particular meaning. Your positioning in the village suggested flight rather than settlement, and most significantly, when Edward Ashford's name was introduced as primary suspect, your response was not of someone whose actual guilt had been discovered, but rather of someone whose convenient sacrifice had begun to occur. You knew I had not killed him, Iris Blackwood asked with evident surprise. I suspected, Miss Marple corrected, that your guilt might not be precisely as it appeared, but suspicion is not knowledge, and I could not have prevented the conviction had the true perpetrator not chosen, through her own moral reckoning, to end the deception. What I could do was present facts in a manner that opened the possibility of truth being examined more thoroughly. The rest was dependent upon human conscience and the particular vulnerability of individuals who have committed acts they fundamentally regret. As Iris Blackwood prepared to depart, Miss Marple pressed into her hands a small package containing her address in St. Mary Mead. Should you ever require counsel or friendship, she said simply, you have only to write. I suspect your life will contain considerable further complexity before it settles into peaceful routine. When it does, remember that there are places in the world where people understand that justice and morality are not always identical matters. Iris Blackwood departed into the December darkness, and Miss Marple returned to her cottage with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has confronted a complex moral situation and emerged with her understanding of human nature and her faith in the possibility of moral reckoning fundamentally intact. The trial of Margaret Ashford took place in the spring of the following year. when the English countryside had shed its winter severity and returned to the gentle productivity of renewal. Miss Marple did not attend this trial, as she had attended Iris Blackwood's, believing that her presence was no longer required to ensure truthful testimony or proper consideration of evidence. The case had become, through its reversals and revelations, sufficiently public that the machinery of justice could proceed without her observation. Yet she followed its progress through newspaper accounts and through correspondence with Inspector Thornton, who had developed a habit of consulting her regarding matters of interpretation and moral complexity that the official legal system seemed ill-equipped to address. Margaret Ashford's defense was conducted with considerable skill by a barrister, who sought to establish that, while her actions constituted murder in technical terms, the circumstances that produced them warranted consideration of mercy in sentencing. He presented character testimony regarding her years of selfless devotion to her family, her reputation in village society as a woman of principle and generosity, and the particular desperation that had motivated her intervention on her son's behalf. He called psychological experts who testified regarding the particular pressures faced by women of her generation and social position, and he emphasized the provocation that Dalton's threats had constituted. The prosecution countered with arguments regarding the premeditated nature of her actions and the particular gravity of the crime when committed by someone of considerable social standing and presumed moral awareness. They argued that allowing Margaret Ashford's crime to be excused through appeals to desperation and maternal concern would establish dangerous precedent regarding which individuals in society might claim exemption from accountability based on their circumstances and intentions. The jury's deliberation lasted 3 days, and when they returned with a verdict of guilty, but with a strong recommendation for mercy, it became clear that they had engaged in the same moral calculus that had occupied Miss Marple throughout the investigation, the acknowledgement that Margaret Ashford had committed murder, but murder that arose from comprehensible desperation rather than malice or calculated cruelty. The judge, the same elderly magistrate who had presided over Iris Blackwood's trial, imposed a sentence of 12 years' imprisonment with eligibility for parole review after 8 years, a sentence that was considerably less than the 20 years that murder typically commanded. Edward Ashford, cleared of any involvement in Dalton's death and freed from the threats that had driven his mother to violence, left Thornfield within months and established himself in London, where he pursued a career in banking with considerably greater competence than he had previously demonstrated. Constance departed with him, her superficial beauty proving insufficient to sustain a marriage. The crisis that had bound them together had dissipated. Lady Ashford remained at Thornfield Manor, though the garden never quite recovered its former magnificence, the roses seeming perpetually diminished by the knowledge of what had occurred among their thorns. Inspector Thornton was promoted to the rank of Chief Inspector following the case's resolution, his handling of the investigation's complexities having earned considerable professional respect, despite its initial missteps. He visited Miss Marple one final time in the spring, bringing with him photographs of the village as it had returned to ordinary routine, and the particular quietness that settles over places where extraordinary violence has temporarily disrupted the ordinary patterns of existence. "The case has taught me considerably more than I anticipated learning," the inspector confessed, settling into the now familiar chair in Miss Marple's sitting room. "I entered into the investigation believing that facts and evidence would lead straightforwardly to guilt and accountability. I discovered instead that guilt and accountability are far more complicated matters, and that truth often requires moral intuition alongside forensic certainty." Miss Marple smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose life's work had been validated in unexpected fashion. "The law requires certainty," she said gently, "but human behavior is fundamentally uncertain. We do what we believe circumstances require, and we interpret our own actions through the lens of our own circumstances and understanding. Iris Blackwood believed herself guilty long before she took responsibility for a crime she had not committed. Margaret Ashford believed her actions justified long after the moment when justification became morally indefensible. And Edward Ashford believed himself threatened by circumstances that were, in their ultimate, resolute. ion, considerably less threatening than he had feared. "And Herbert Dalton?" the inspector asked. "What did he believe?" "Herbert Dalton believed," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, "that power derived from financial control and legal manipulation would protect him indefinitely from the consequences of his own cruelty. He was, in that assessment, entirely wrong. But his wrongness does not render his death just, nor does it render those who caused that death innocent. It merely renders the situation tragic. A collision between desperation and arrogance that could have been prevented had Dalton possessed sufficient wisdom to recognize the limits of his own power. As spring turned toward summer, Miss Marple resumed the ordinary patterns of her life in St. Mary Mead. She attended village events, she gossiped gently over tea with her friends, she maintained her garden and her correspondence, and she observed the ongoing patterns of human behavior that constituted the substance of her never-ending education in human nature. The case of Herbert Dalton's death became, gradually, the kind of historical event that villages retain in their collective memory, whispered about during quiet afternoons, referenced obliquely during discussions of morality and justice, but gradually displaced by the ordinary occurrences that filled daily existence. Yet Miss Marple never entirely relinquished the case from her consciousness. She retained in her desk drawer the letters that Iris Blackwood sent from Switzerland, describing her new life and her gradual reconciliation, with the knowledge that she had attempted to bear responsibility for another's crime. She maintained correspondence with Inspector Thornton regarding Margaret Ashford's progress through the prison system, learning with satisfaction that the woman had achieved a kind of redemptive understanding through her imprisonment that had eluded her entirely in freedom. And she observed, through village gossip and newspaper accounts, the slow healing of Thornfield itself as a community gradually moved beyond the trauma of having harbored murder within its seemingly peaceful boundaries. The Sparrow Nest on the old coat, that peculiar detail that had initially seemed insignificant, had contained within it the seeds of transformation that had rippled outward to touch every individual involved in the affair. In the end, Miss Marple understood that this was the nature of violence and its consequences, that small seeds of desperation, when planted in the soil of human circumstance, grew into plants with deep roots and extensive branches, affecting far more individuals than those who had initially set the violence in motion. Justice, she reflected, was not the eradication of these consequences, but rather the honest acknowledgement of how they had grown and why, and the commitment to ensuring that such growth would not occur again.